Salim Vali is in education, actually, and is based at the University of Johannesburg. Robert van Niekerk. Oh, it's always nice to have academics on the panel, you know. There's always this bit of a thing about academics, but they are thinkers. Many of them are good thinkers.
And spoken word artists.
Okay. Another spoken word artist here is Robert van Niekerk, who's at Rhodes University in the Institute of Social and Economic Research. Then I have Brooke Spector, who's one of my other favorite kinds of human beings, a journalist. Well, that's what he is at the moment. He used to be a diplomat and worked for the American Embassy. We make very clear that Brooke speaks here absolutely as Brooke Spector and not for any government when he says anything this afternoon. And Iain Robinson, you will know as Ewok, a true spoken artist, or one who really does it with style and rhythm, which the rest of us can't quite make claim to. Okay. So let me outline a little. I think this afternoon's conversation is quite a complex one. These are very important conversations and debates to have, but they are quite complex. And charting one's way through this territory is also fairly complex. As South Africans, and we're not all South Africans by any means, but as South Africans, we lived through a process and a period of cultural boycott in addition to other kinds of boycotts. And it was a particular I was going to say weapon, but tool, strategy on behalf of those who wanted to see a change, a political change in our country. And I suppose one of the complex things about a cultural boycott is that it takes something that is intended, culture, arts, intended to be free and boundaryless and flowing and able to touch and move and reach across cultures and boundaries and political edges and so on and so on. It takes that and turns that into a tool of a political aim. So that relationship between those two types of energy, those two types of endeavor is I think, a complex relationship to put together. And we'll explore that in some ways. But then also there is the situation where we deal in general, and we've framed the question as a general one, cultural boycotts. Are they effective? And it would be nice to know, wouldn't it? When you call for these kinds of things, how do you know what you're getting into? How do you know that the strategy you've embarked on actually has the ability to deliver for you what you are aiming for or hoping for? So the big general question is an important one to engage with, and it's important to engage with it in that abstract intellectual way. But then there are also specifics around us. And so we're going to try and straddle these different kinds of things. We're also straddling the general and the personal, and we will do that on the panel too. Some of the panel will speak in those kind of general terms. Some of the panel will remind us of our history and remind us what lessons we can draw from the past, and some of us will speak very personally. I'm going to start with Mike van Graan. Each of the panelists will make a shortish input, and then we'll probably do some clarifications, and the panelists, who are by no means all of one mind, let me tell you, if you had lunch with them 10 minutes ago, they will probably pose questions to each other or want to challenge each other, and I think we might take that first, and then we'll open it up to the audience for further questions and conversation. But I think, Mike van Graan, we want to start with you because of your location in Africa working with African artists. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's begin there. I'd like to approach this question based on experience of the broader African context through Arterial Network, which is a Pan-African civil society network of artists and cultural activists that seek to develop the arts in their own right, but also as a means to contribute to democracy, to respect for human rights, and the eradication of poverty. I'd like then also to preface what I have to say with 5 little stories. First, a range of organizations in Cape Town is considering a boycott of the Labia Theatre because of its refusal to show Roadmap to Apartheid, a film about why Palestinians themselves believe they are living in an apartheid state. Secondly, a few weeks ago, the ANC and the SACP called for a boycott of city press until such time that City Press removes a photograph of a piece of art, the spear, from its website. Third, last year the Swaziland Solidarity Network, COSATU and other allied organizations called for a cultural boycott of Swaziland and of the Bushfire Festival in particular. This year, a South African company, MTN, became the title sponsor of Bushfire Festival, and their 2012 audience was their biggest ever. The fourth story, a friend has as a Skype status that she will not buy anything made in China until they agree to an international plan to end the slaughter of Syrian people. And finally, a resistance festival of culture, a counter-festival to the National Arts Festival, where we are today, has been initiated by organizations representing the unemployed of Grahamstown, labeling this particular festival elitist. From the stories I've told, there are at least 3 reasons why cultural boycotts are embarked upon. First, as a political tactic or as a coercive strategy to bring about change. Such change can apply at a national level, changing a country, or an institution, such as the Labia. Secondly, as a means of raising awareness about a particular situation. So while the Resistance Festival is not calling for a boycott of the Arts Festival, they are highlighting the 70% unemployment in Grahamstown. Thirdly, as a matter of principle, the boycott is unlikely to bring about change or even raise significant awareness, but it is a statement of moral principle, whether by one individual, such as the woman who says that she's not going to buy anything from China, or by an institution, an organization, or a group. It's important to distinguish between these reasons, or the primary reason for instituting a cultural boycott, because too often what starts out as a political tactic becomes a principle, a kind of punishment meted out against an offending party, rather than understanding how to apply that boycott as a tactic within given situations. I'd like to talk a little bit about the African context. As we know from our own South African experience, the proposed media laws, the fascist response of the ruling alliance to the spear, the often brutal responses of the authorities to service delivery protests, all show that the struggle for democracy is an ongoing one. We haven't achieved democracy as such. We've witnessed similar struggles for human rights and freedoms in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya. Within all of these, democracy still has a way to go. While there were only 3 African countries considered electoral democracies in 1890, there are 18 now, as opposed to 24 in the period 2005-6 to 2008-9, reflecting the fragility of democracy on the continent and the constant vulnerability to more autocratic forms of political authority. While the continent has seen significant economic growth in the last 15 years, with 7 of the fastest growing economies in the first 10 years of this millennium being African countries, that has not changed the fundamental conditions of most Africans, 50% of whom still live on $1.25 a day, which was the same statistic that goes back all the way to 1981, when the World Bank first introduced these kinds of measurements. Wealth has become the preserve of a politically connected elite, not only in our country, but, for example, the richest woman in Angola just happens to be the president's daughter. Most African governments do not support the arts, and where they do, there's little tolerance of art that is critical of the status quo. In many countries, artists are jailed, intimidated, harassed, assaulted, and killed for daring to exercise freedom of creative expression. Fates not unlike those of journalists, whistleblowers, and political activists. As Arterial Network, we organize civil society activists precisely to promote, defend, and monitor freedom of expression, to build organizations and leadership capacity to hold governments accountable, and in so doing, contribute to democratic practice and respect for human rights. With so many countries, including our own, disrespectful of human rights, democracy, and guilty of perpetuating poverty, it makes little sense for us as an organization to impose blanket cultural boycotts in a one-size-fits-all manner, as we would have to do it for most African countries, including our own. Do we have media boycotts of countries that suppress the media, imprison and kill journalists? For me, the arts play a very similar role, or can play a similar role, because the arts can also be very much part of asserting the hegemony of those in power as well. I have a little thing about what our South African experience was, having been involved at that time, but I'm going to leave that to colleagues to basically do, and maybe just conclude with a position on cultural boycotts that might make sense for us from within our continental experience. The first point to make is that cultural boycotts are legitimate change tactics and principled expressions of moral outrage. While they are employed as political, or where they are employed as political tactics, it needs to be made clear as such, because it may be that while repressive political conditions may be the same for country X and for country Y, or the conditions in country X may even be worse than in country Y, a cultural boycott is applied on country Y because of the particular nature and state of the struggle for justice there. The cultural boycott is a political tactic in that particular instance, to be applied strategically rather than a political principle that is applied to all countries experiencing a similar set of anti-democratic or anti-human rights regime. So looking for consistency in the application of the boycott is simply not going to happen. For this reason, there is no cultural boycott of China, despite its poor human rights record, or of the USA, despite Guantanamo Bay or its illegal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there was no cultural boycott of South Africa during its genocide against people living with HIV. In closing, cultural boycotts as a political change tactic or as a means to raise awareness, one, on their own are relatively meaningless, having more symbolic value, and are most effective when, first, they are part of a broader coordinated strategy that includes more forceful change tactics, particularly economic and political sanctions and the like. And secondly, where there is broad political support for such strategies from wider society and internationally from African and global communities. Secondly, in my view, they should be applied selectively, on the one hand targeting governments and the associated elites who are responsible for the relevant injustices, and on the other, supporting progressive artists and cultural organizations as vehicles to promote and defend human rights and freedoms. Thirdly, they should be devised and implemented in consultation with progressive cultural organizations and artists in the country concerned, rather than simply be imposed, as was the case in Swaziland, where last year they kind of imposed this cultural boycott and the artists felt, you know, we're not going to go along with it because we are simply being, in this very undemocratic way, being obliged to go along with it. And then you have companies like MTN actually providing much greater support to the Swaziland regime than what arts and culture organizations could. And finally, they require, as a political tactic, constant monitoring and adaptation to ensure the effectiveness of the tactic, hence the need for some kind of mechanism to monitor and to change the tactic as necessary. These, for me, then, are the broad principles to consider when thinking about and applying a cultural boycott. As to whether they work or not, this would be related to the conditions of struggle prevalent at the time, the political maturity and vision of the implementers, and the ongoing strategic adaptations made in accordance with changing conditions and time frameworks. Thank you.
We're going to turn to Iain now.
From my own personal experience with cultural boycotts, I'll break down exactly how I got involved with the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement and became involved with the Palestinian Academic Cultural Boycott Institution. In that interaction and in the situation that took place last year in KZN that I was involved in, the action highlighted 2 points for me that I think speak to the idea that cultural boycotts are, in fact, effective. 2 degrees, very effective in some ways. In other ways, maybe not so effective, but I think the topic for me, are cultural boycotts effective, is very broad. You will always find a way that they could be effective, you know, to certain people. So for me, as an artist, I was meant to perform at a theatre arts festival that takes place in my home province, KZN. And it's a festival I've always participated in. It has always been very supportive of me as an artist. It's always given artists in KZN a new platform to work on. And yeah, it's quite a, you know, a personal sort of a festival to all of us artists there. And so it was a big decision for me to do it. And up until, literally the story was, I had been booked personally in my personal capacity as an artist to perform at this festival. And up until the very night before my first performance, when I was going up to the festival to conduct my technical rehearsal, up until that point, I had upon finding out that the festival was and had been approached by various solidarity and activist groups to disinvest or divest from accepting Israeli participation and the festival declining and moving forward regardless, I had decided to use my performances up until that point to speak about the occupation, to speak about the situation in Israel, to actually work within the festival to raise awareness about the reasons that this festival should be divesting, and other festivals and other similar institutions, the National Art Festival included. And up until that point, that's what I planned to do, but I received an email on my very smartphone, which was very irritating at the time because it was a very good email to get. I got an email directly from South Africa's BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Steering Committee, that pointed out and highlighted various very simple and obvious points about the nature of the relationship between any institution and the Israeli government and its complicity in breaking the line or crossing the line in terms of the boycotts. And at that point, I decided that I could no longer go forward, and I canceled my performances, and the rest is my BDS history. But that interaction highlighted two very important points for me. One, the manner in which a boycott is conducted, and as Mike has already touched on, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, a boycott can be and is a very precise, targeted means of resisting oppression in this case. And two, it also highlighted the origin of this boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And the fact I also like to bring up the points, we do get a lot of criticism or fingers pointed in terms of why one and not the other, why single this one out. And I think gentlemen are going to get into that a little bit later. But my interaction was I got an email from within Palestine. I got a direct personal call from Palestinian artists, Palestinian academics, people who were on the ground inside Palestine experiencing the oppression that we were resisting. It was a personal call. It was not I didn't wake up one morning, decide that I didn't like injustice to the point where I was going to pick a cause and this was going to be it. I was actually, literally, it was like someone coming up to me and going, hey, please help me right now. And it basically pointed out to me that this boycott, divestment, sanction, and the idea of a cultural boycott is effective, very effective, in letting the people on the ground who are suffering know that there is a voice and a solidarity movement that is out there that recognizes their position. So two things. One, that, and also the other thing was the way and the manner, the process that they got hold of me, the manners that they went through, the very specific, almost legal jargon that was used to describe the nature of a relationship between the Israeli government and a complicit arts organization like the festival, showed me that it was being conducted in a very precise, thought out, logical manner. It was very, very specific. It wasn't broad. It wasn't painting everyone with the same brush. It wasn't crass in any way. It was very, very smooth, smart, thought out, something that I could relate to straight away. And so that's my own personal feelings on boycotts. Yes, I do feel that they are very effective. And just a few additional notes before, I don't think I'm going to carry on too much longer. We want to get into what other gentlemen have to say here. But I work as a Dennis Brutus scholar at the Center for Civil Society and UKZN, and I have taken my lead in terms of my participation in boycott, divestment, and sanctions from Dennis Brutus and his work as the leading the sports boycotts during the years of apartheid in South Africa. And a few quotes, or a quote from Dennis: there are times you have to demarcate the area of struggle where you have to almost allow your enemy to define the parameters and then fight within those parameters, and that is exactly what boycotts do. They recognize, for example, and I'm going to use Israel as an example, they recognize the fact that Israel uses culture as a weapon of the oppression. They recognize the fact that Israel uses economics as a weapon of oppression. And the cultural boycott addresses that imbalance, or uses then the same weapons, culture and economics, as a form of resistance, as a form of defense. And boycott, divestment, sanctions, again, I think its strongest and most effective use is that it puts the power back into the hands of a disenfranchised, disempowered people. We know very much that the situation in Israel is one of incredible imbalance in terms of politics, economy, military, basically every facet of a society that makes up a society, or a certain society around a certain people, is very, very imbalanced or unbalanced in Israel. at the moment. And that imbalance is addressed by boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It basically puts the power back into the hands of the civil society of Palestine, the Palestinian civil society, and gives them a means to address the politics and the economics and the cultural attacks that they are under, using the same non-violent, passive resistance methods that have become practiced, as part of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. So for me, amongst a variety of other things, also knowing that there are, young Palestinian rappers who I've actually met and I've interacted with that are on the ground there, that listen and watch for all the sort of moves that boycott, divestment, sanctions makes, in the hopes that one day, it will help. I don't think BDS or boycotts are going to end anything tomorrow. I don't think boycotts are going to just suddenly end the occupation tomorrow. I think they are part of a very large, thought-out strategy, just as they were in South Africa. People talk about there being 4 pillars to the resistance in South Africa. There was internal resistance, there was violent resistance, but part of it was the international pressure that was brought to bear on the South African government that contributed once again to the internal resistance that already existed. That is the point of a cultural boycott coming from outside. The call has come from within, we've responded from outside, and they are using that support and that strength and that solidarity to strengthen their internal resistance, because the true change we know is only going to come from within, and that's essentially what boycotts and how they are effective for me.
Okay, Robert.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to present in this panel and engage in this important discussions. I want to concentrate my discussion about the effectiveness of a cultural boycott on the case of Israel. And the question was asked, are cultural boycotts effective and will they be if applied to Israel? My answer to that is yes. I believe cultural boycotts can be effective and they can be so in the case of Israel. What a cultural boycott applied to Israel serves to highlight to the international community is the scale of human rights abuse and brutality that is the daily lived experience of Palestinians in the occupied territories. Many of you may be familiar with the record of human rights abuse in the occupied territories. For those of you who do not, the scale of human rights abuse is evidenced most tellingly in the case of the Gaza Strip, where 450,000 Palestinians live 71 kilometers from the capital of Israel, which is Tel Aviv. The blockade of the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, by the Israeli government is now entering its 6th year. It was instituted by the Israeli government after the election of Hamas in a democratic vote 6 years ago. And according to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, as a result of the Israeli blockade, 44% of Gazans are food insecure and 80% are dependent on foreign aid to live. 85% of schools run on double shifts in the Gaza Strip, and severe shortages of fuel and electricity result in 12-hour daily outages. According to the international charity Save the Children Fund, the Israeli blockade has prevented crucial sanitation getting into Gaza, with its sewerage system completely broken and the water in Gaza too contaminated to drink. The daily experience of Palestinians in Gaza is thus one of routinized oppression by the Israeli Defense Force. According to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, since the Israeli blockade of Gaza imposed 6 years ago, 2,300 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces. This is compared to 37 Israeli deaths due to attacks launched from Gaza. And in the words again of that United Nations office, what is happening in Gaza is, and I quote, a denial of basic human rights in contravention of international law and amounts to collective punishment. The situation in Palestine is extreme and dire, and there is nothing comparable in the experience of blacks in apartheid South Africa as what is happening over a cumulative period of time to Palestinians in its systematic brutality is, in my opinion, far worse than what was meted out by blacks by the apartheid regime. It is that bad in my view. In response to the call to support the struggle for a non-racial democracy in South Africa, the cultural boycott of apartheid South Africa served to highlight the anti-apartheid struggle, and it did so effectively for 2 key reasons. It firstly allowed people in the international cultural community who abhorred apartheid to actively demonstrate their support through non-violent means by making a moral choice with political implications not to perform their art in a society which subjugated members of another community on the basis of their race, and therefore dispel the idea of normality in that society. Equally importantly, it forced white South Africa to confront the abhorrence of the international community felt against apartheid in the places of civil society within that white society, the concert hall venues, the theaters, the movie houses, the sports stadiums. It forced white South Africans, in other words, to confront the implications of the society they had chosen to live in and to take responsibility for those implications. In this case, cultural isolation and the associated existential uncomfortableness and disruption of the everyday life. That as a white person, they could not enjoy the good cultural life in the same way as they were not being allowed not to know, quote unquote, about the implications of apartheid to their fellow black inhabitants. For blacks, many of whom anyway were denied access to these cultural events due to the Group Areas Act, it dramatically signaled that the international community was taking a collective stand against apartheid. This act of solidarity sent a clear signal. We do not know about apartheid, and we do know about apartheid, and we are deciding to do something about it. By making a choice not to perform and to campaign for the end of cultural performances in order to draw attention to an abnormal society and not to collaborate with its regime. At the height of the cultural boycott in South Africa, the sight of 80,000 people attending a Free Mandela concert in London, led by artists who refused to perform in apartheid South Africa, was a huge boost for those struggling inside the country, and such sustained cultural pressure, combined with the pressure of economic sanctions and the resistance of the internal mass movements, undeniably contributed to the apartheid-era South African government conceding to hold negotiations with the ANC and other banned liberation movements on a new democratic order. This is why, for me, the cultural boycott against Israel is such an important non-violent mechanism, as it takes the struggle for Palestinian rights into the heart of Israeli civil society. This, for me, is where the battle of ideas about a new Israel, which equally protects its citizens regardless of the ethnicity or religious background, needs to be fought and won. In the words of an Israeli activist group working to support the boycott of Israel and in solidarity with the Palestinians, and I quote, they say, Israeli public opinion and the country's political agenda will change only when the price of continuing the status quo becomes too high. We believe that by ending the occupation and establishing equal and just political arrangements in Israel, Palestine are also in our interest as Israelis. So it's when the majority of Israelis come to the same realization as these progressive-minded Israelis supporting Palestinian rights that a shift in consciousness will occur and a just resolution achieved to the benefit of both Palestinians and Israelis. A cultural boycott of Israel will not in and of itself ensure that shift in consciousness, but it can significantly contribute to such an outcome. In the words of Roger Waters, ex-found member of progressive rock band Pink Floyd, who refused to form in Tel Aviv after being petitioned, and who is now a supporter of the cultural boycott of Israel. And I'll end with these words of his. Where governments refuse to act, people must, with whatever peaceful means are at their disposal. For me, this means declaring an intention to stand in solidarity not only with the people of Palestine, but also with the many thousands of Israelis who disagree with the government's policies. My conviction is born in the idea that all people deserve basic human rights. This is not an attack on the people of Israel. This is, however, a plea to my colleagues in the music industry and also to artists in other disciplines to join this cultural boycott. Artists were right to refuse to play in South Africa's Sun City Resort until apartheid fell and white people and black people enjoyed equal rights. And we are right to refuse to play in Israel until the day comes, and it surely will come, when the walls of occupation falls and Palestinians live alongside Israelis in the peace, freedom, justice, and dignity that they all deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to be part of this conversation, and you'll detect an American accent, I suspect. And that's partly because for many years I worked for the US government, and as your chair says, quite rightly, I don't represent them. I haven't for almost a decade now. I don't represent anybody except myself, my own views, but necessarily my views are influenced by my experience and what I think I have learned or what I think worked and what I think does not. And it is colored in particular by my involvement on behalf of the US government in the 1980s and 1990s in managing the American cultural participation or lack of it in South Africa. And I think that informs to some degree my sense of what is the right thing to do now for circumstances now in various places or for the future. I think it's important to start out by saying that there are views that are different about the nature of the purposes of art in its international dimension. For some people, of course, art is for art's sake. The artist, the individual, creates what they're going to create, and the circumstances beyond that are not their problem. They belong to the audience's problem. There are other people, of course, who argue that art, culture, performance is necessarily a weapon of a struggle, and it can be a variety of struggles, and Mike has listed a number of them, and I don't want to refer to them, to list them again. Historically, at least, the very notion of a cultural boycott against South Africa dates back to the early 1950s in its explicit form. The late Reverend Trevor Huddleston proposed a cultural boycott against South Africa. He also proposed an economic and a sports one at the same time. But even Huddleston recognized that art and culture were tools and not simply blunt instruments. And one story from his time in Johannesburg, even though he was a proponent of a boycott, when he learned that the British violinist Yehudi Menuhin was coming to Johannesburg, through a friend of a friend of a friend, he made contact with Menuhin and said, I know where you're performing and I know this isn't fair and right to the rest of the country. Will you come with me to my church in Sophiatown and perform there? And he did, and Huddleston very clearly decided that it was in the nature of things that they confront the government of the day, and they deliberately invited, word of mouth, mail, people of all backgrounds. The doors were wide open, the windows were open, there were hundreds of people inside the church, many more outside. Even at that beginning of the process, it was clear to its proponent, its father, its progenitor, that you use culture as a way of getting something to happen rather than simply to punish a society for whatever purposes. By the end of the 1980s, even the African National Congress in exile had reconciled itself with an understanding that a blanket one-size-all policy was less than useful. This led, in turn, to the establishment of the so-called cultural desks that vetted, that approved or disapproved performers coming into the country or going out. But arbitrary and odd choices sometimes happen. An observation I would make from that is that a blanket boycott by its nature becomes a very blunt instrument. There is always what I would refer to as collateral damage. Within the US government, we looked for our programmatic niche, what we could do with American groups, with American performers who either were planning to come to South Africa for performances or who would be invited, because by 1992 it was very clear there was a very different horizon to look towards. But we decided that necessarily we would insist upon a whole range of ideas, a whole range of connections, of support, of outreach, of performance, reaching into the society rather than simply performing for audiences. And the lesson we drew from this was that one uses culture as a tool for a particular purpose, that is better democracy, more democracy, less restriction, etc. Now move forward to just a little while ago, a year and a half ago or so, when the Cape Town Opera from this country was planning its trip to Israel to perform the American opera, George Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. And the argument that I wrote about was 4 parts. The first part was, why not, and as a journalist I could make recommendations, whether people would take them or not was their business, but I could at least state my position of what I thought was the right thing to do. That the question was important as to why not use the trip to reach out to groups and build on the idea of reconciliation, which is a theme that is close to the heart of most South Africans, but force the issue of that precise discussion. Second, one should make sure that any performance, workshop, etc., is open to all proactively, not simply a little tiny sign in the window, everybody who wishes to come can come, but you make sure that the effort itself is designed from the outset to be open to all. That the organizers and the performers should make it incumbent upon themselves to encourage those who otherwise would not be able to or would think they could not come to attend, that the sponsoring organizations should be forced among themselves to consider the intent of their own actions. What must they do to make sure that condition prevailed? And finally, one needed to remember that not everybody in a country, not everybody in the arts and culture of a country is necessarily a spokesman for their country's current particular political policies. If that is true, then should boycotts unilaterally and unequivocally affect them as well? I'll give you one example, which goes back to the late 1980s in this country. Two artists, Mbongeni Ngema and Johnny Clegg, both names familiar to most people, both were going to perform in Europe. And the then existing cultural desk and exile groups said that Mbongeni Ngema was more than welcome, but that Johnny Clegg was not. And the distinction as to why the two should be different eluded me, and I think it eluded Johnny Clegg as well, because it would be hard to explain what he had done individually. Put the position in the case of Israel, think of theater people such as Moti Lerner and Noam Semmel, who have been vocal and active in their dissent from the nature of their government's current and particular policies. A boycott, should it affect their right to travel, to perform, should it affect their right to do the things that they feel as an artist to do? Having said all of that, let me offer one other historical observation, well, two actually. Some years ago, you may remember in Austria, Jürgen Haider, the neo-Nazi leader, gained a significant share of political power in a coalition government he effectively headed. There very quickly arose within Europe opposition to his presence in government, and because of the particular nature of Austrian society, tourism affects perhaps 15% of the country's GDP, and cultural tourism is a major portion of that. People do want to see the castles, the music, and so forth. The Salzburg Festival became a topic of some import to people. There was an increasingly strong boycott of the Salzburg Festival. Individuals who had been invited refused to participate, refused to offer their funds, refused to be cultural ambassadors on its behalf. But the circumstances of Austria are very different than they are in most countries. You'll find it very rare to find a society anywhere where 15% or so of that country's entire gross domestic product resides in its tourism and cultural tourism. But the question then leads us to, if Israel, if South Africa, if Austria, why not, and where is the pressure for a boycott of North Korea? North Korea clearly is a repressive society. 500,000 people or more are in prison. Very few people get the right to have 3 square meals a day, let alone 2. Freedom of expression is non-existent. Right to travel is virtually nil. Why is there no cultural boycott of North Korea? And at the same time, all countries practically in the world are trying to use culture as a way of reaching into that society. The New York Philharmonic, for example, took several years to arrange a trip to North Korea with the willingness of virtually everybody else to allow that to happen. If not North Korea, China. China has prisoners in factories. China has children in factories. The Tibetans don't particularly think China's civil rights policy is effective and appropriate. Why not Saudi Arabia? 50.1% of Saudis are unable to drive a car, unable to vote, unable to have any expression. Why not Cuba? Some people may think Cuba is an appropriate, useful place. Freedom of expression in Cuba is limited too. The question of a cultural boycott, then, is more complicated than simply that society is doing bad things to some of its people. I want to close with just a quote from one of the artists who chose to go to Swaziland's bushfire festival, even though the boycott was announced. And this is Philippa Ja de Villiers, the poet and writer. Artists are like doctors who minister to the emotional and spiritual needs of people, no matter what their color or creed. If I am called somewhere to present my poetry, I go. I have been to the Harare International Festival of the Arts. I have been to the Havana International Festival of Poetry. I've been to the United Kingdom and performed there. All of these regimes have moments of grand larceny and oppression. South Africa, too, has its own post-liberation embarrassments. And she concludes this letter by saying, finally, I'd like to say something about this conscience question. Part of the coercive tactic of getting people to join the cultural boycott is playing into the fear of the repercussions. If I go, I won't be popular anymore. Nobody will see any merit in my work. It would be the end of my career. These are all practical concerns, but are they really my conscience? Is that all that my conscience is, the question of what they will think of me as an artist? And I think we're left with the question then, how to use culture as a tool and a tactic to change a society. If so, which societies and what kinds of change are we after? And then what do we do with the circumstances of the collateral damage that happens? And if all of those questions are still answered, do we really have the right to make the individual distinction, this society versus that society, this country versus another? I'll wait to hear other comments and questions from you out there, my colleagues on the panel, and we look forward to a good discussion.
Thanks, Anthea, for pulling together this panel and the wonderful hospitality of the organizers. And to you for coming to listen to us. The one important point I want to start with is the fact that Palestinians are not hapless victims. They have a voice, and they've spoken. An overwhelming number of organizations in Palestinian society, almost the whole of Palestinian civil society, and almost all the cultural workers have said, we want the boycott. They are the oppressed. It's an asymmetrical situation. The people with power, as Iain has said, is the Israeli state. So in July 2005, they called for a boycott, divestment, sanctions, a BDS campaign inspired by the anti-apartheid struggle in our country. And what they called for is basically three things. They called for the ending of Israel's 1967 military occupation of Palestinian territories, ending the system of racial discrimination against Israel's Palestinian citizens, dismantling the apartheid wall, which the International Court of Justice in 2004 condemned, and of course the ending the persistent denial of the UN-sanctioned rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. Those were the demands. These are not outrageous demands. It's in line with international law. It's in line with human rights discourse. That's vital. I think it also distinguishes Palestine from a number of other countries where you have the organized cultural workers, civil society, who've made the call. The second point is that Israel is an apartheid state. Some call it worse than apartheid, as Robert mentioned, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu called it. Others called it apartheid of a special type, like Graan Greenstein. It's all variations. The important thing is, as Professor Dugard, South African voice on international human rights law, Professor Richard Falk, Princeton law professor as well, and now with UN Human Rights Council, they all call it apartheid. They use a UN resolution. It was passed in 1976, and it's not specific to South Africa. Any country that practices certain discriminatory laws are guilty of the crime of apartheid, and Israel has violated this particular law. Besides these people that I've mentioned, it's also the HSRC that put together a very comprehensive, scholarly, which can be downloaded free of charge, by the way, from the web, why Israel is an apartheid state. So, the point is, it's not why do we single out Israel, it's why does Israel single out itself? Naomi Klein has written a brilliant piece why she supports boycott, divestment, sanctions. And she talked about, for example, at the time of the apartheid regime in South Africa, we also had the Pol Pot regime. There's no comparison between the two in terms of the number of people that were killed, genocidal. But yet the Pol Pot regime, in fact, boycotted itself. The difference, so Israel is not unique in terms of racially discriminating against indigenous people. It's certainly not unique in that sense, but it is remarkable that Israel has gotten away with its discrimination, its genocide, the Nakba, where 2/3 of the Palestinian population were driven off their land, expelled from their villages. And Israel is seen as the victim today. It's supported by the US. In fact, the victims, the Palestinians in Gaza, are boycotted. You know, it's a medieval siege there. You can't even get chocolate unless you take it through the tunnels. And the US and some European Union countries have spearheaded that. There are a number of myths. I brought with me the Palestinian guidelines on the boycott campaign and their call for you to have a look at yourself. BDS does not preclude joint Palestinian-Israeli cooperation projects so long as they recognize Palestinian rights, uphold the basic needs for freedom and equality, and unambiguously aim to end Israel's colonial oppression of the Palestinian people. They have set out very careful criteria. Now, many of the objections to the academic and cultural boycott are in fact based on a wrong premise, that Palestinian organizations are calling for ostracizing individual Israeli academics, writers, and artists. It's far from the truth. The Palestinians have discussed with South Africans involved in the struggle to isolate the apartheid regime, and they realize that we cannot call for boycotting individual Israeli artists. It's an institutional boycott. It's the Israeli state that uses culture to disguise and hide the naked oppression. And the guidelines that I have speaks to it. Israel also whitewashes, pinkwashes, etc., the crime of apartheid very well. And this is what needs to be exposed, not individual Israeli artists. In terms of the effectiveness, BDS started in 2005, I mentioned, and over a period of 6 to 7 years, it has been incredibly effective as a vehicle to challenge Israeli impunity. The victories of the BDS campaign in such a short time far overshadow what we were managed to do in that period of time in the struggle against apartheid. The call, and Ewok has mentioned that 1959 was the first call, 1963 was the first effective action, and we only got our elections in 1994. So the successes of the BDS campaign and its effectiveness, the fact that we are discussing apartheid now is a success in itself. The psychological issue that Ewok talked about, Archbishop Tutu also said that for us in our struggle in the darkest days, the psychological aspect of this, knowing other people support our struggle and are prepared to sacrifice, and it's not lucre at Sun City or any other kind of temptation. It requires sacrifice. There's a whole long list of people who have come to support this. The late Jill Scott Heron, Elvis Costello, the Pixies, I can go on. Madge Ryan, Dustin Hoffman turned down talk at the Jerusalem Film Festival. Roger Waters, we had John Berger. John Berger, when it comes to culture, understanding art, there's nobody as inspirational as John Berger. Judith Butler, as far as I'm concerned, a key living philosopher, living legacy. There's also people like Arundhati Roy, Augusto Boal. I'm talking to people who are playwrights here. They know the significance of people like Augusto Boal. All of them, Andre Brink, and I can go on, have all made the point why they want to, why we should boycott. I want to end by saying that academic freedom, cultural expression, surely under conditions of civil war, violent occupation, apartheid, colonialism, must bear some reference to the very conditions for the criteria of its determination. That context, to be specific about it, it's contingent on that context. Art can't rise above politics. It does not operate in some special apolitical space. And it is not removed from complicity in systematic human rights abuse. Israel uses culture to sell a prettier face for Israel. The whole question of branding Israel, a new image, is essential to their attempt to continue to hoodwink the world. I want to say that the BDS movement is not asking for anything heroic from people of conscience. It is merely asking us to desist from complicity in oppression. And really the corollary of what Brooks was saying, there's a woman from the Jewish Voices for Peace who said a very vital thing. She said that Palestinians have lived for the past 6 decades from one trauma to another, one tragedy, one slaughter, one theft to another. And she said that in the frenzy to discredit the BDS movement, it's perversely easy for critics to forget those facts, obfuscations, canards. The US have boycotted culturally a rich society, Cuba. They've boycotted many people, so it is for me the height of hypocrisy to say why Israel, when it is the country that has violated more resolutions and conventions and treaties than any other country in the world, yet it is Israel that is pampered and privileged more than any other country in the world. If we believe in human rights, in international law, then it is the duty of every one of us to call out this hypocrisy and to specifically listen to the voices and the views of the Palestinians who are using a non-violent way of getting their rights that we today take for granted. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim. Okay, we want to bring you into the conversation, so I'm going to get up and I'm going to move around a bit. But I want to just check if the panel wants to respond to anything that was said. Yes,
Just a
please
quick,
go
I'll try and
ahead.
make this quick.
Yeah.
Something that touched on a number of points that you made mentioned the idea that boycott should never be used as a blunt tool. And the Reverend Huddleston said it himself. Culture needs to be used as a tool, not a blunt object. And the fact is, as Salim has quite correctly pointed out, the Palestinian Academic Cultural Boycott Institute and the BDS movement have published very clear guidelines that make the BDS movement, boycott itself, a very clear, sharp, specific, targeted tool. For an example, one of them, 6 or 5 in the guideline, the event or the project promotes false symmetry or balance. This is a guideline for a specific type of event. Cultural events and projects involving Palestinians and or Arabs and Israelis that promote balance between the two sides in presenting their respective narratives as if on par are otherwise based on the false premise that the colonizers and the colonized, the oppressors and the oppressed are equally responsible for the conflict, are intentionally deceptive, intellectually dishonest, and morally reprehensible. Such events and projects, often seeking to encourage dialogue or reconciliation between the two sides, without addressing the requirements of justice, promote the normalization of oppression and injustice. Now that is a very clear, specific, targeted point of attack. All right? Again, something that is not just a blanket, blunt tool. The idea, again, of applying a boycott to a specific country, China, Korea, from without guidance from within, is ultimately patronizing and misguided. Patronizing to assume that the terms of a people's resistance should be dictated by outsiders, essentially.
Okay, Brooks.
Is that on still? Just a very quick response or rejoinder, really. I think it would be very difficult to expect the North Korean artistic community to issue a memo to the outside world because they don't have access to it. And they may fear for their lives or they may fear for the lives of their families. This is not an argument for boycotting North Korea. It's simply a point that circumstances in the world are necessarily complex. They're not simple. I mean, in summary, the world is divided into people who think there are 2 alternatives and those who don't.
Okay, wait.
That would assume then, sorry, that does assume then
also
that
bring in the audience.
that have called for the boycott are not under some sort of threat for their lives, or that they're not taking some sort of risk.
Ewok, I didn't say that.
Oh, no, no.
Sorry.
You didn't say that. You didn't.
Okay,
I assumed that. Sorry.
let's get your questions. Let's find out what you want to ask. Okay, right. Coming back.
Hello. Okay. I don't have a specific person I want to address, but I just want to bring up 2 sort of points which I think are necessary to really figure out what we really need to discuss in this debate. One is just a sort of brief point about, which will bring me to my second point, really, about sort of the nature of why a boycott is effective in Israel as opposed to North Korea or another society. I mean, obviously, the first thing that springs to mind is that North Korea is a very closed society. It's not exactly as though there's a culture going in there, and it's not exactly, with a few exceptions, including the National Youth Conference that had in South Africa a few years ago, it's not exactly that North Korea makes an effort to go out and convert everyone to their brand of Stalinism or whatever you want to call it. But that's sort of aside. But the more important point, I think, when we want to deal with and this is my main point, with the cultural boycott of Israel, is the way in which Israel society views itself. And it's very similar, in fact, to how South Africa during apartheid to view themselves, white South Africans. They viewed themselves as an outpost of the West, as a sort of colonial outpost of the West, in touch with Western civilization, in touch with the metropole. In instance, if you walk around, it's still very clear in parts of South Africa. Cape Town's a good example, and in Tel Aviv, people think themselves as a European city within a non-European land. It's very much, they want to be accepted as part of the European cultural community, and there's always this need among white South Africans still to feel accepted by the European and American cultural community. And that's where the real effectiveness of a boycott can be in terms of shifting consciousness in Israel, is that if you make them feel like a pariah from this community, you feel that the community that you want to belong to doesn't want you. We don't want you. We feel that your state doesn't represent our values. Regardless of talking about the individual merits of these countries, that is which is the effective measure about shifting consciousness within Israel. And that also brings me to, a discussion of something which is not really spoken about, is the nature of how this manifests itself. And one of the things is quite interesting, that Israel football teams, rather than playing in the Asian League, play in the European League. So in terms of the championship, the UEFA Championship, there are Israeli teams competing. They're just views that Israel manifests. And the last point I want to make is quite interesting within Israel society, is that the identity of Israel is even more complex than you make it out to me. It's not just Palestinians which are being oppressed, in the sense that Israel is increasingly meaning white Israel, meaning white descendants of European Jews. It doesn't mean there's a substantial proportion of Jews from Ethiopian Jews who are black, and Jews who are from Middle Eastern descent. Even though they are accepted legally within Israel society, they don't occupy positions of power. They're increasingly being marginalized. There's this identity of maintaining white Israel, and this white Israel is the European Israel. And that's another. And the final point is that if you look at what's happening with this current sort of mini pogroms against black refugees, this is a manifestation of this white Israel, and that's where we need to target them.
And then anybody else want to add into the debate? And then we can turn to the panel again.
I think I just have a very simple thing, which is really a response to, I suppose, the conversation of the two, which is that politics has to simplify things. You can't say we can't do the politics because it's too complicated. It always is complicated. Every history of every country, apartheid is there were always exceptions to the rules. But if we hadn't had if we hadn't imposed something, the shaming that you're talking about, maybe nothing would have happened. So there is some sense in which a cultural boycott has to be simplified. I think I just want to put it.
So, and another one? Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentations. I find as an artist, it's really interesting now to contemplate on collaboration, on travel, on where you're traveling. And I think too few artists take the time to do that. And I would say across sectors as well. You could be in the business field, you can be in the sciences, but there are very few people who take the time out to contemplate that. And also, as a hip hop artist from the States, I genuinely create and support work that supports positive energy and messages, but I do boycott any message that is demeaning to women, demeaning to society. And I was wondering if any of you can talk on specific ways and examples that cultural boycotts are tied directly to consumer boycotts. Thank you.
Is there anything else we can add into the mix before we turn to our panel? Is there a hand? Yes. Okay.
I think the argument that was made about North Korea and China and all these other places where there are human rights violations and so on it puts us down a slippery slope, because what it's asking us for essentially is complete political apathy. If we're to say that we can't have boycotts everywhere, therefore we shouldn't have them anywhere, I think that's a bad argument to make. And it's putting us into a position of political paralysis, where there's so much going on that we feel that we can't do anything, so we should just do nothing. Yeah, that's.
Thank you very much. Can I add a question in? I want to ask about Swaziland, Zimbabwe, these sorts of countries around us, because I think, Mike, you've made me aware I'm not spent time thinking about the situation in Swaziland. There's so much that's right here, right within, that larger Southern African space that maybe needs better attention. And, while we're thinking about Swaziland, should we not think about Zimbabwe? What are we doing here? What is the thoughtful approach to this? So can I add that a bit into the mix? Who would like to start with a response to any one of the questions? Okay, Brooks, you start.
Let me go back to the question that was posed about slippery slopes and apathy. I was not, for example, saying because there is injustice in Saudi Arabia or North Korea or China or Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan or the Sudan, that therefore there are so many injustices that you can do nothing. Rather, that anything you do, anything a collective does, anything an individual artist does, anything a government does, needs to take into consideration that there are lots of circumstances that require contemplation and a decision about what constitutes an appropriate response. That the world is sufficiently big that you can't ignore the oppression in North Korea simply because you wish to focus on the oppression somewhere else. The problem is in figuring out what tools and mechanisms work in place A or place B. The little colloquy we had, for example, in the case of North Korea, and I'm not a specialist in there, I've actually spent about 8 seconds and 2/5 of 1 foot in North Korea, so I can't claim to be a specialist. But it is clear to me that it is impossible for North Koreans individually or collectively, unless they are exiled, to make any sort of representation. Their circumstances are so unique. Even so, some countries, some governments, some cultural institutions felt it was appropriate and useful to make the effort, to make the connection, as in the case of travel of orchestras from the US and I think one other country who have been there, and efforts by a few European countries to actually have scientific exchanges with North Korea in spite of all. And the problem or the challenge is figuring out the mechanism that fits a society and a circumstance that doesn't at the same time take out all the other people and organizations along the way simply because you cannot easily make the distinction and therefore you just do something. And that also, may I just segue to the question of politics has a, politics, how was it phrased? Politics, in politics we have a need to simplify things. Yes, we do. We have a need to simplify things. I agree completely. But we also have a need to remember the complexity of those things too. And we can't simply say all countries that do X are equally complicit or equally bad, because there are degrees of badness. There are degrees of complicity. There are degrees of oppression, and some are worse than others. And we need to keep that in mind. We need to have enough focus on what we're doing to be able to see cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. And that's really the problem. And my own experience in working to bring a major American performing group here at the end of 1992 led me to say, if we do that, we need to be aware of the local circumstances thoroughly. We need to make sure and to ensure that all of the activities, whether it's the supporting orchestra or the workshops or the master classes or whatever the heck it was, that all of it went toward goals we had defined rather than simply accidentally accepted. So there was a need to be complicated in our simplicity. And I think that applies more generally. I have 2 microphones all of a sudden.
Right, Mike.
I just wanted to say on you asked about Swaziland and Zimbabwe and the like. And you know, the point I was trying to make earlier was that cultural boycotts are legitimate political tactics, but I think that they are most effective when they are part of a bouquet of strategies to effect particular change. Because if one had to assume a particular hierarchy of boycotts, what would you put at the top, what would you put at the bottom? I would imagine the cultural boycott would be at the bottom. Economic sanctions would be at the top, military sanctions, those kinds of things would be much more effective ways of persuading those in power to, bring about change. And I think that's what the case was in our country. The cultural boycott was the first boycott lifted after the negotiations or after the ANC was unbanned. As a kind of reward, a symbolic gesture to F.W. de Klerk to say, look, you've done well, we're lifting the cultural boycott. And then the sports boycott, because then suddenly you had your cricket team going to India in 1992 before elections had happened. So, but they kept the oil boycott and the military boycott, going until such time that the new constitution was in place and until such time that election happened. So, for me, looking at a place like Swaziland, what I resent as an artist is when an artistic event like the Bushfire Festival becomes a very easy target, that you suddenly get political activists kind of targeting that particular festival, because despite it not being a supportive mechanism for the Swaziland regime, why not boycott the Monarch's Reed Festival, or something that is really significant in terms of that. You have a situation where, for example, Cyril Ramaphosa, former NAM General Secretary General, is the chairman of MTN's board. MTN is invested, as are very many unions in MTN that is in Swaziland, Now, for unions then to come and say to artists, you mustn't go, but we are going to be there generating income for our union. It's just, that kind of thing for me just doesn't fly.
Yeah.
So I think that when you're engaging in these kinds of activities, that there needs to be consultation across the board, and that we need to come up with a concerted campaign that everyone kind of buys into and everyone understands it, and everyone says we're committing to that because we can see the importance of this.
Just as an additional, would you agree then as well that it should come from within? I mean, essentially it should come from, as much as possible, in as much as possible, it should come from the people to whatever degree they can, even if it's just a cry for help and then we pick it up, but it should come from as close to the problem as possible.
Can I add
Or, are we able to just jump in on a problem because we recognize it and assume our own tactics?
So can I add in, can I ask also, if it's a cultural boycott, then it involves the artists inside. Are they absolutely necessary in the consultation? Because it seems to me that the big corporates, the big media corporates, sometimes the large, we had state-sponsored artistic institutions in South Africa. Many individuals, or authentic, organizations on the ground can get crushed in these big political processes. So can I add that on? Yeah. Yes, about individual artists. Yeah. Mike, do you want to maybe try and...
Yeah, sometimes artists are not very well organized within particular countries. So to have a voice on behalf of artists is sometimes quite difficult. Yeah. And part of what we are trying to do as Arterial Network is have exactly that. One of the reasons why the arts are not taken seriously in many countries, why governments sign up to major international policy instruments, why they even adopt cultural policies but never implement them, is because they're never held accountable. And this, artists are... they kind of feel at the bottom end of the political food chain, but then they don't organize themselves to be able to do something different about it. So this is why we are engaged in that. Yeah. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that it needs to come from inside. That can be part of a broader campaign, but where those organizations exist, we must make an effort to engage with them and consult with them in order to make sure that those strategies are effective. When the cultural boycott, although it was called for in 1959, it really only became a major part of what organizations began to do in the mid-80s. When the disinvestment campaigns began to really take off internationally. And at that time, there were very few internal organizations, so that the ANC actually initiated organizations like the Congress of South African Writers, FAWO, Association of Community Arts Centers, and I was all part of those, that particular time in the mid-80s, because they needed advice from inside, from organizations about who was okay and who wasn't okay in terms of traveling abroad, etc. So, there was a case of where there's an absence of organization, actually go up to organize artists in order to have that mechanism to monitor the effectiveness of the boycott.
Okay, thank you very much. Salim, you want to?
Yeah, there's a few very important things. I've listened to Mike very, very carefully, and clearly the question of the boycott being not a dogma not a principle, that it being a tactic, is something very important. I think all of us agree with that. The fact that people inside have a voice and discuss this is vital as well. Now, all those criteria are met by the BDS call very clearly. I think that many of us are involved in support for the Zimbabwean struggle, for the Swazi struggle, even for Darfur, and many other struggles. We don't divide that. And the point that was made about why, particularly in terms of Israel, the BDS campaign, besides meeting these criteria, would be effective, was extremely well articulated. Israel sees itself, I mean, it's incredible, the symbolism. It's like, for those of us of a certain age and grayness, or holding on to our hair, the kind of language is so familiar. The apartheid speak about the last bastion of Western civilization. Of course, people are a bit more sophisticated today, but that kind of logic, and it is tactical because it will be effective. Like a knife, if it's used incorrectly, it becomes blunt, it becomes ineffective. The great boycott in California, called by Cesar Chavez, was effective against California grapes. There are many such examples, some given by Brooks as well. I mean, it doesn't have that impact on North Korea as it would, and that is part of the tactical thing. The Cape Town Opera, I mean, Brooks, really, I support Archbishop Desmond Tutu on this issue. His statement about the hypocrisy of going there when there are Palestinians who live just a few kilometers away, but because of the apartheid wall and the apartheid policies, they can't go to the Cape Town Opera, whereas a Jewish person in an Israeli settlement can go there. Anthea, I sent you that lovely video, I hope you saw it, about Madonna. I'm not a fan of Madonna, and I'm not sure if this was satirical, but she was in Tel Aviv recently, and these two Palestinian brothers in the West Bank bought the tickets, and they wanted to go there. So this thing about these cultural acts will really bring people together, hold hands, kiss each other, reconcile, is really ridiculous. You know, it basically perpetuates the system. It gives the Israeli state greater legitimacy. Our aim should be to delegitimize them, to stop them from hoodwinking people. When they put those labels, it's made in Israel. We say, no, it's made in the occupied Palestinian territory according to international law. That's what we should support. This thing about, sorry, I'll stop.
Yes, okay. I do want to pick up on this statement because you also, Salim, you know, you had the litany of this person is not going, this person is not going, and so on. And quite often the choice falls on the shoulders of the individual artist. Now, if you're a big name Madonna, I think it's easier. You know, you look. Well, I mean, Madonna, you've got to see the YouTube video. If you just Google it, you will find it. The two brothers try desperately to get across the wall. They can't find. There's this one very funny scene where this fellow's on a phone asking for permission, and he needs a directive from a higher authority. And of course, all he has is a ticket that he's bought. He doesn't have a directive from a higher authority. And, you know, that brings us to satire. Satire plays a role here too. But I am very interested in, you know, are we saying to, I mean, Madonna can take advice, and she can certainly look around her and see, you know, what other artists have decided to do. But, you know, in the case of an individual company, and, you know, we're asking people to be incredibly politically savvy. And it seems to me that you, the panel, are saying to us that, in fact, there's not a one-size-fits-all boycott. There is a very careful, sensitive, understanding the situation, knowing what the politics are, getting the context right, and then making choices and decisions based on that. So I want you to answer the question about that individual artist. Yeah, just use the mic. And maybe Mike too, because having lived through these.
I agree completely. That's why in South Africa and in many other countries, you have now groups called South African Artists United Against Apartheid. I mean, Iain talked about that. Joni is here. There are many other people who have studied the thing, talked to other artists around the world, talked to Palestinian and Israeli artists. There are many Israeli artists who support Jewish artists who support the boycott campaign, like there were white South Africans. You know, it's not surprising. So there are nuances, and people are learning, and they make mistakes. They make mistakes like we made mistakes. And in every struggle, I was telling Mike, we were involved in the boycott campaign, but there were things that happened there that we're not proud of. There were gatekeepers that more often than not, they were then checked, and there was a struggle within a struggle. It is complex in that sense. The nuances are important. The most important thing, as Anthea has said, is to understand the facts, because there is so many, you know, the crudest form is that you are anti-Israel, you are anti-Semitic. That is the crudest form. Of course, it becomes more sophisticated. But that kind of canard doesn't hold true any longer. Most artists, because of the boycott campaign, have educated people about this issue. So I think there are organizations to go to. There is a vibrant debate. And, you know, far from curtailing freedom of expression and creativity, in fact, the struggle has resulted in a flourishing debate and greater clarity. And all the time we are learning and enriching that.
Okay, Robert.
Thank you. I think the points have been very well covered by my colleagues on the panel. I think I just want to make and reinforce the point about how do you choose between which country and another. And I think the point very powerfully for me is that in these countries we can make a difference. Brooks, as an American citizen, it's the American government's support for the Israeli regime that's able to maintain the regime in that particular location and its geopolitical role within the Middle East. As an American citizen, you need to stand up and say, I do not support the way that my government is supporting the Israeli government in terms of the occupation, in terms of the settlements, in terms of a whole range of human rights abuses. That's where your voice can be heard. Your voice would not have as much power if it had been in a country like North Korea, because, of course, it's an isolated country.
Was there
but that's precisely the point why you should be being an active voice in relation to what's happening in Israel, because it can make a difference. Since 2000, America has exercised its veto 9 out of 10 times. In those 9 occasions, it's been in support of Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Okay, I'm going to bring in somebody here who wants to comment.
One really important thing to think about, that if you are in the American media and you're working for the American media and you say anything about Israel, you are blacklisted immediately. There was a woman, Helen Thomas, she was a press representative at the presidential place at the White House and such, and that actually happened to her. So she did experience that, and I saw her speak at this lovely venue called Busboys and Poets that brings people together in DC and to speak on progressive topics such as this, which I think is a very important issue to consider as well.
So that's it, far from even curtailing freedom of speech.
And I have one more thing to mention. One thing to keep in mind is that for U.S. foreign aid, the top country that receives foreign aid is Israel.
It's
very interesting.
So the argument that is thrown against boycott, divestment, and sanctions all the time is you're curtailing freedom of speech. And as you can see, not just with BDS, with like organizations like that, far from it, the minute we recognize that freedom of speech is not being observed, platforms are created for it, because we know that freedom of speech ultimately is going to be what drives this movement forward. You know, your comment was also about consumer and the consumer boycott and the cultural boycott. And in a number of ways, I think one of the ways that they are the same is awareness. Obviously, when we choose to culturally boycott, we are creating awareness among the public. Why are you choosing to do that? Why are you choosing not to go there? This is why, the occupation. The same with the economic boycott. Why are we boycotting these? Why do we want labels? Why are we not asking for Israeli goods? The same, because of the occupation. So there's an awareness thing that happens at the same time. And then at a level of, let's say, Madonna, you know, if large artists, Elvis Costello, Pink Floyd, are pulling out, they're also pulling capital out of that country, huge capital, because those are major, big concerts and big events that are putting capital and injecting it into the occupation or the illegal apartheid economy. And by pulling out, they are effectively contributing to an economic boycott at the same time. So they can work together.
Okay, I'm going to come to Brooks, but I do want to say, I mean, what Robert has made us aware of is not just this kind of case-by-case country analysis that needs to be done. There's a geopolitical analysis here. And what we have is our superpower, you know, in the mix here. So, Brooks, we know you don't represent this US government.
No, I don't.
And you are the lone American on the panel.
But
you know, could you address that too? Think about that.
It's become something of my fate living here to somehow be the default, de facto explainer of things American. I mean,
feels very familiar. We did that in the 80s, didn't we, as South Africans?
I do a lot of it, and it's sometimes I wish that the embassy or other voices would be more visible, because I don't like being the only one. But having said that, I think two parts to this. First, I think in response to the particular interjection, I've made my feelings fairly clear, both in print here on TV and in my communications to the US government more generally. I don't happen to have a huge animus toward the government on all things. I disagree on some things, and when I think that's the case, I say it. Does it mean the embassy here loves me enormously as a result of that? No. Does it mean I get invited to the good parties? No. Does it mean that they answer my questions? Absolutely, because now they're a little worried. But as far as citizens are concerned more generally, there is a lot of discussion, and I don't want to use the word agitation, but there is a great deal of churning of discussion. Now, I mean, in the case of Helen Thomas, I think it was an unusual circumstance in a way. She went beyond a certain line that is sort of standard in political public discourse. A lot of people were uncomfortable with the way she said what she said, and she's paid a price for having done that. Any number of people who disagree with US government positions on Israel voice it all the time within Congress, in the media, and other places. Having said that, and one needs to understand this too, and it's something I spend a lot of time trying to explain to people. If you want to find the locus for American support for Israel in an unconditional way, as opposed to an argumentative, they shouldn't do this, they shouldn't do that. If you want to find the unconditional support base, you look at the Christian fundamentalist, charismatic voter. There are 35 million fundamentalist Christian charismatic voters in the United States. There are 70-some million such people. So some children don't vote, obviously. It is the single largest repository demographically of Republican support. So if you are really concerned with whether a voice is being made, the solution is to become a fundamentalist Christian charismatic minister and make your voice known. There you go. Hallelujah. I have the microphone too, that's great. But no, in all seriousness, that is, without that support, the Republican Party would never have won either the 2000 or 2004 election, putting aside the fact whether they won the 2001 in the first place, 2000 election in the first place. But it is the single largest repository now of electoral support for the Republican Party, and a significant number of congressmen and senators. So that is where the real locus of influence now within the automatic, reflexive, instinctual support for Israel on any circumstance. The second thing I wanted to mention briefly. When we talked about the Cape Town Opera trip to Israel, I was not among the Kumbaya singing choir, all right? I said there were some very specific things that you had to do in order to be able to be both true to your own circumstances historically, the nature of this society, and the ability of your using art for the purposes of political activity, for the purposes of advancing a particular set of goals. No, it was not simply to say, you're all welcome to come to visit the performances. It was, as I explained at the beginning, to make sure that as a part of the trip, tickets were not just available theoretically, but available actually, that workshops, master classes. You are not going to change the essential nature of the difficulty in moving from Bet Yamin to Tel Aviv simply by virtue of that one act. You may, in fact, begin to have some impact on the way other Israelis believe their own society is put together. And that was how I described this as a process, as opposed to simply an official labeling of an event as open and free for all. And I was trying to be very, and in fact, I had this conversation with the head of the Cape Town Opera. I said, you need to set out a series of goals, objectives, checkpoints that you want to see achieved.
Okay, we have a question. Then I think if you want to say something, you please must in the next 5 minutes. Otherwise, I'm going to hand over to the panel and start wrapping the whole thing up. So you've got to get your hand up if you want to say something soon.
I want to just confirm the fact that it is nuanced. And that there never can be a one-size-fits-all. So I want to make that very clear, and that coercion will never work anyway. But at the same time, it is a lot simpler than what is being implied. And one of the myths is that it's so very, very complicated. It actually is not complicated. The Palestinian Society have made a direct call. Whether others can or can't is actually not, it's a spurious, as you said, leads to paralysis. The situation there as well, there is Israel is enormously powerful in terms of its hasbara, its propaganda. We know that as South Africans, how powerful propaganda is. We don't know how critically dire the situation is in Palestine. We don't have much more time for endlessly civilized conversations. We do need to reach a point, we do need to set a timeline. We do need to say, we know how to do this, we've been there. As Mike and Salim said, we've made mistakes. We know what the mistakes are. We are so well equipped to set up a timeline and say, this is where we're going to act, this is where we're going to be in solidarity. And also that it is an incredibly powerful thing, the 80,000 people in London. I can remember that so distinctly as being one of the first times I could raise my head in a long time as an activist, because I otherwise felt so incredibly alienated and alone. And the fact that there were those 80,000 people on the other side was unspeakably powerful. So I think that the conversation tends to get a little too civilized. If I can say that in conclusion.
What I'm going to do is take all these questions and then we can all have a final statement. Yes, you.
I have a question, I suppose a two-part question, but I speak as a Zimbabwean, and when you talk about cultural boycotts, for me, it doesn't resonate at all, because what you have in Zimbabwe is a situation where some artists have started boycotting the Harare International Festival of the Arts, and they've made this decision, and it's supposed to be this big thing, this declaration, but it doesn't resonate with the people that are struggling in Zimbabwe, because for them, that's an overestimation of the arts. The arts are not an integral part of their lives, because they're struggling to survive. And so the people you're trying to connect with don't connect at all, don't make the connections with the artists that are saying we're not coming to Zimbabwe. And then I suppose, you get to a point where these artists are not coming through, and there's a chance that there is no festival next year. And in a city where there's 93% unemployment, where that 1 week of that festival has provided employment for a number of people that would never have had anything to have that year, you have created a situation where their well-being as well is threatened. And so what role then at that point does cultural boycotting take? Because one, the people you're trying to support don't relate to the arts in that way. And secondly, their well-being is being taken away for that 1 week, which would have been an integral part of their lives in the way the arts are not.
Is this the last hand, or is there anybody else who wants to get in? Is there another one?
Okay, I just have 2 quick points. One, sort of a minor quibble with Brooks. I mean, I guess he's being picked on, but it's just something he said earlier. When you said that the major repository of sort of electoral support in terms of demographic base for unconditional support for Israel, yeah, it is the evangelical community, and that's an undeniable fact. But what's curious, I mean, and is that at times the Democratic Party, with maybe a few exceptions in Congress, is as reflexively pro-Israel, even if they talk a little bit differently. If you look, in fact, at the history of United States relations with Israel, some of the harshest, if we use the sort of term, hawks on Israel, have been Democrats or ex-Democrats like Joseph Lieberman. But it's just, I think the question, the question is, is really how did the United States, at least elements of society, regard Israel as like the 51st state of America? It's something which you find often, that there's sort of this intimate connection as a country. The second question is for everyone, and it's a bit minor, it's something I've always been debating with myself, is just in terms of travel to Israel. I mean, you have the option as going as a tourist if you want to go to the West Bank, if you want to see the country. What is your responsibility as an activist, as someone who's committed to the cause, about traveling to Israel? I mean, I've always wanted to go, but I've got problems with it.
Just a couple of things. Brooks mentioned the fundamentalist Christian support in America. Quite recently, CBS 60 Minutes program really explored the situation of the Christians in Palestine, their dire situation. And actually there was then a huge flood of comment and support. And I'm quite sure a lot of the fundamentalist Christians had to look at the stance that they've been taking. The other thing was that I've always felt that a lot of artists in this country and important people in theatre feel that the cultural boycott here affected audience education. I know Ralph Lawson, for one, has expressed that opinion to me, that it was a tragedy that for so many years meaningful ideas were withheld from people here. But that will never happen to Israel, because it has huge support. The Israeli government has huge support outside Israel, and there are so many wonderfully talented Jewish artists who will continue to support Israel. Some of them are beginning to be embarrassed, and I think the point you made was a very good one. That's what we want to do, is actually make the people who really matter, the people who are supporting Israel now, feel really awkward and embarrassed and saddened by what their government is doing, as we felt during the apartheid era. And in fact, I think perhaps one of the reasons why one feels so passionate about this issue is not that one is anti-Semitic, but that it is so close to you. I have Jewish members of my family, and I feel very deeply saddened for their sake that this is happening in Israel. So we are so close, unlike the Northern Koreans. Frankly, I wouldn't even know how to begin to tackle that problem.
Okay, I think yes. I'm going to start with Mike because he hasn't said a hell of a lot. Yeah, take this one.
Okay, maybe just to respond to a couple of things. On the issue of whether to travel to Israel or not, my own position is that with regard to the cultural boycott of Israel, I would support the notion of not traveling there much more on the basis of the expression of moral outrage than on the basis of political strategy. Because for a country, in terms of international power relations, that is supported by the USA, that has no compunction about boarding a flotilla of ships in international waters, a cultural boycott as a change political tactic is going to make no difference. So for me, it's an expression of moral outrage as to whether I go there or not. And if I do, then it will be on the basis of consultations with friends and colleagues in Palestine. Secondly, with regard to, it's funny that we should be talking about this because I think one of the first plays I did in Grahamstown after engaging in a cultural boycott of the Grahamstown Festival was something called Some of My Best Friends Are Cultural Workers. And it was a satire with a colleague of mine from Congress of South African Writers, and we were being satirical about the cultural desk. But to plug the Brothers in Blood, another play that I have here at the moment, actually speaks to some of the things that Brooks was speaking to earlier on about. It's quite often we see the issue as being a Muslim-Jewish kind of conflict, but actually it's religious fundamentalism of Christians that most kind of dictate, to a large extent, American foreign policy to some extent. I think maybe just a final thing with regard to Zimbabwe. I think you're completely and utterly right, and that's what I was trying to talk about in terms of the presentation I was making from within an African experience, where so few countries actually support the arts. In fact, for them, if there's no art, it would actually be better, because sometimes artists can be problematic by raising issues of criticism and the like. And so this is why we see it as our role has been important to support artists in order for them to be exercising freedom of largely critical expression. But having said that, to come back to an earlier point that you raised, you were talking about artists needing to be informed. For me, there is absolutely no excuse for artists not to be informed. Absolutely no excuse for artists not to be informed, other than their own laziness. And I think it's one of the things that really irritates me about artists is that actually they kind of have this notion of art for its own sake, not recognizing at all that art and culture happens within a struggle for political hegemony, a struggle of ideas, and whether they recognize it or not, that's where they are located. And if they are not recognizing it, then they're on the wrong side.
There's a fascinating letter I saw written by Reverend Aronson, Stiaan van der Merwe, who used to be a colleague of Beyers Nudier, Martha Momberg, Dudu Masangu, etc., against Reverend Mushwe, who is part of that radical right-wing Christian fundamentalists who's linked to the very people, Brooks, in the States. It's the same logic. And of course, they're a powerful force. But there are a number of Christians, even evangelical Christians, who are challenging them. They are not as formidable. I mean, they have terrible positions on LGBTI people, on women's rights, reproductive rights, and it's a particular worldview which is very interestingly supportive of Israel. So, I think that particular essay, a letter, is fascinating because of its lyricism as well. And it addresses many of the issues we're talking about. Why single out Israel? It addresses that very clearly and talks about the terrible plight of Palestinian Christians and how they've been driven out of Jerusalem increasingly as we speak. These settlements continue. Children get detained, there are a number of political prisoners, etc., etc. I can go on. And I think there are a number of groups. There's the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program, young Christians going to Palestine and seeing for themselves. There's this open Shahuda Street in South Africa, which does the same in Hebron, the kind of things happening there. And I want to encourage people to go there, not for holiday, to have a good time, to scuba dive in Eilat or whatever, but to look at solidarity and to look at how people are resisting in a united way throughout the world. You know, there were moments in modern history when the whole of humanity came together. It happened during the Spanish Civil War, during the struggle against American imperialism in Vietnam, the struggle against racism in Southern Africa, and now they say the moment has arrived for Palestinians. And when I think of young Americans like Rachel Corrie, who paid the ultimate price, their lives, in solidarity with Palestinians, there are many other Americans and Europeans and South Africans in our country. In fact, apartheid, in a sense, still exists. The suspicion, the walls, literally and metaphorically. But it's through the solidarity movement, in fact, that we are breaking down our own walls. In the Palestinian solidarity movement in South Africa, many of whom are involved in Zimbabwean struggle, etc., they are people who come from different religious backgrounds, different colors, and I know this sounds all great, etc., but it's a reality. I've met more people in this country involved singularly, passionately about the struggle, Jewish people, Christians, atheists, etc., black and white, and that movement is vital for me as well. So I think this is the way to build bridges. And Samora Machel's quote, you know, that we use so often in the 80s, it's almost a cliche. Solidarity is not an act of charity, but it's really support between allies fighting in different terrains. This is what the Palestinians and others, in fact, expect of us as South Africans who benefited from this solidarity of people around the world. And we have possibility of, contributing to that international movement.
Salim's very eloquently captured my own thoughts on this. I won't restate that. But I also want to say there's another way of looking at culture as an act of resistance. And for me, the illustration is the East-West Divan Orchestra, started by Edward Said and Daniel Barenboim. And there's a wonderful documentary which we hope to screen in Rhodes at some point on this orchestra. And one very poignant moment in that documentary is when the Israeli youth and the Jewish youth go with the East-West Divan Orchestra to go perform in the occupied territories. They actually performed at the Cultural Palace in Ramallah. And they had to be smuggled in under the very noses of the Israeli security forces. And I think that is an illustration of the possibilities of culture transcending the divide. And what I think was also very interesting for me was what Edward Said and Daniel Barenboim were trying to suggest with that act. He said it's not just symbolic. When we brought together these Israeli youth and these Arabic youth in an orchestra, we found that through engaging in music, through a non-violent form of action around the issue, and what they would do is Barenboim would lead them in the day around orchestral arrangements, etc., and Said would lead them in the evening on a masterclass on the Middle East. And just think about that. And the result of that was an orchestra that is fated around the world. And people go, for example, to the proms to go and see the East-West Divan Orchestra, not because they just represent the symbolism of pan-Arabic and Israeli youth being able to work together, but the fact that they are a world-class, fantastic orchestra, that people queued around the Barbican to see the orchestra, and I believe for the first time in the history of the proms, they're going to perform all of Beethoven's concerts and performances. And I think that is the power of the possibility of culture as an act of resistance. And that's what I would point to as we boycott, we also look to these other forms of cultural action and which we need to support. And then on visiting Israel, my own view is we shouldn't be visiting Israel. We should be visiting the occupied territories as acts of solidarity. I, for myself, who for 30 years has been aware of the Palestinian struggle, I've also been aware, for example, there's another country which my consciousness was raised not to support and not to visit, and that's Turkey. A lot of South Africans visit Turkey because of the oppression of the Kurdish people. And I think that's settled in one's consciousness, and it's how then one actually gets to understand it's not the issue of Turkey, but it's about what resistance is going on around the Kurdish people in terms of their culture and supporting that, in terms of voices that are not ordinarily heard. And I think to speak out and say, consciously, I'm not going to Israel for this reason, but I'm going to try, because you'll have to try and get in there. It's not going to be easy to get in there. I am going to try and get into Ramallah as an act of resistance, even if it is a symbolic act of resistance, I think is the way for us to help support this campaign. Thank you.
I was actually very heartened by what Robert just said about the East-West Divan Orchestra, because to some degree that echoes my explanation of what I suspected was the right approach for Cape Town Opera to take, to use their participation in the world of culture as a way of making a political difference, even as they are artistically and aesthetically valid. Forcing people who want them to come to bend themselves to the needs of the visiting organization is an act of proactive participation in the political sphere from the world of culture. And let me just now go through a couple of points. To the individual who said, things are simple and we've had too much civility. Well, no, the problem is things are complicated, and it is our task to somehow to simplify complexity without traducing the nature of the complexity. You have an obligation to be honest about what it is you're seeing, as well as being clear, and you can't simply sacrifice the one for the other. To the student from Zimbabwe who posed a dichotomy between participation in culture and participation in the economy, you're absolutely right. It's really it's an invidious division, and it's not fair. And you shouldn't, and the Zimbabwean artist and the unemployed Zimbabwean person doing work in the cultural festival shouldn't have to make that choice. Unfortunately, that's the way the world sometimes fits together, and it requires people to find clever ways to make the cultural point through the economic, or the economic through the cultural point. I wish I had a simple answer for you. I think that Philippa de Villiers' point was that individual artists, unfortunately, are forced with that, and they have an obligation to somehow make that choice for themselves. But you're absolutely right. It simply isn't fair to the person who's unemployed and who was counting on that participation as a way of feeding their family for the rest of the year. Grahamstown Festival is no different. There's 70% unemployment in this immediate area. Some people make do for the rest of the year on what they earn for the 3 weeks of the festival, the run-in, and the breakdown. And I've talked to any number of such people. And if this festival were boycotted for a political reason, I'm not entirely sure what the right response would be. And I think it would be the same set of questions and contradictions and difficulties. Quickly on the U.S. Electoral process, 2 points apply. Most people in the U.S., congressmen, senators, are not elected on a national basis. They're elected district by district by district, of course. And as a result, people are often victorious or defeated on local issues, but also on the basis of pressures and interests. So that if you have a congressman in a city, in any particular city, they're going to make choices about what they support in the interest of gaining voters, in the interest of gaining political support, in the interest of gaining financial contributions, in the interest of simply wanting to identify with something that others do. The difficulty for outsiders to understand about the United States, and I don't have a simple answer for you, Americans have come to believe that in a difficult, dangerous part of the world, the Middle East, the Israeli state represents a political structure that is by and large democratic and by and large aligned to U.S. interests in that region. Like it or dislike it, that's the prevailing view for most people. The polls say that to you over and over and over again, and it isn't even a function of whether you're Republican or Democratic. It isn't even a function of whether or not you are the evangelical, fundamentalist Christian voter. Most Americans feel that way. The number is somewhere in the neighborhood of 85%, which is a considerable weight because 15% usually doesn't win you an election. The question about the evangelical Christians, they are not for the most part lining up on the side of Israel on the basis of specific political or strategic policies. They are lining up with Israel for eschatological reasons, for the primacy and immediacy of predictions in the last half of the book of Revelations. And you may or may not want to be in that place in your head, but that's where they are. And if that's true, then the politics of the place have very little to do with their actual feeling about this. It has everything to do with this grand eschatological view of the immediacy of the end. Now, not everybody wakes up in the morning and say, today is the last day of society, so I better do this. But many people believe in the immediacy of it. You can make a fairly good living writing a book about the end of days in the United States, but they're read here too. As to the question of Christian Palestinians, yes, but the question of how American evangelical fundamentalist Christians, they're not primarily worried about the question of Palestinian Christians as much as they are of this grand scheme of things. They may take some uncertainty and some awkwardness about the circumstances of Palestinian Christians, but that isn't the primary motor of their view on the issue. As to whether one should visit Israel, and if so, in what way and how, I'm sorry, where did that question come from? Oh, yeah. About 4 or 5 years ago, I went to Israel for the first time. But I made sure in my own circumstances that although I was there to see Israeli theater, which was vibrant and exciting, I also carved out time for myself to go off to the West Bank with a friend outside of the quote-unquote organized program. We used 2 taxis, a bus, and a couple of other things, and we got to where we were supposed to go. And to my wife just shook her head when she heard about this. What is wrong with you? When I got into a Palestinian Arab theater company's offices, I said, excuse me, can I use your internet connection, please? I have to transfer funds in my bank account to my credit card because I had to pay the hotel bill. And somebody
Brooks,
obviously
can you make
was...
this a bit shorter? Yeah. We need to get Iain in and we need to...
Somebody was reading my internet mail because my suitcase took three days to get to me after I arrived. But be that as it may, yes, you should go. And I think you should go because it's important to see the reality of a circumstance on the ground, if you can, if your circumstances permit. I also talked to Christian Palestinian Israelis in Haifa and spent time looking at their needs, interests, and priorities.
Okay.
And I guess
can I hand over to Iain?
I was going to say, and
yeah,
I'll end
thank
on
you.
that.
Yeah,
that's my last note.
Thanks
Cheers.
so much.
Quickly, sorry, 2 points. The sister from Zimbabwe. I've attended Haifa a number of times. I've performed there a number of times. I've worked a lot with different Zimbabwean artists. I was unaware that this year or that there was a cultural boycott that was being implicated for Haifa. I'm definitely going to go in and try and find out more about it. I think it just speaks to the idea that possibly maybe Zimbabwe is not a place where a cultural boycott would work and would achieve its effective goal. And then we talk about, again, the idea that Israel specifically uses culture as a weapon of oppression, and that is why a cultural boycott is effective in Israel. Chances are it's not effective in Zimbabwe for exactly those reasons. But as I say, it's something that would need to be examined if there is indeed a cultural boycott being called. Again, it needs to be approached with that sharp knife and not that blunt object. So you're absolutely right, you know. 2, that leads on to the second point. The other reason, and I'd like to reiterate it even though it's been made, but I think it's very important. As you pointed out, another thing that makes Israel so unique, the reason we choose Israel and not China, and is the amount of support Israel receives. We cannot discount that fact that $5 billion a year goes to Israel, $3 billion of which is used specifically for military aid. That Israel, again, has in fact signaled itself out. It's put itself out there. It's made itself the target that it is. That is what makes Israel unique and why we choose to and are able to so actively boycott Israel. And then the third and the final point I'd like to go on. The time for civil discussion is, I reckon, as well, indeed, over. I don't think that there can be any neutrality in the situation, I'm afraid to say. A quote from Desmond Tutu: during the apartheid struggle, investing in apartheid South Africa was not seen as a political act. Divesting was. That's a very important thing to remember. People don't want to make a choice. I don't want to make a choice. But what they don't realize is by not making a choice, you are making a choice, right? And definitely as South Africans, I'd like to leave on this note. In the wording of the boycott, divestment, sanctions call itself, South Africa appears a number of times. This is not just us contributing to this global thing. We are being targeted specifically as South Africans because of our history. In the wording itself, the Palestinian campaign is inspired by the historic role played by people of conscience in the international community of scholars and intellectuals who have shouldered the moral responsibility to fight injustice, as exemplified in their struggle to abolish apartheid in South Africa through diverse forms of boycott. As South Africans, there is no neutrality here. Not choosing to act is as much of a political act as choosing to act is.
Thank you, Iain. Okay. Thanks. I want to thank the panel. Each one of these people has given a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of thought, a lot of themselves to make these statements, make these choices, speak about them publicly. So